Hi, welcome to the season finale of Variety Tech Today. We're going to talk about mainly Avatar 2, The Way of Water, and also about the state of 3D now at the end of this year. First off, I just want to say there's not going to be any real spoilers, nothing that hasn't been in any trailers, really. Um, I'll start off with the technical stuff. I went to see Avatar: The Way of Water in Dolby Cinema. I'd never seen a movie there before. So the bottom line is, I'm glad I did, and let me explain why. Before that, the only premium format I had seen was IMAX, and there were a couple of variations of that. IMAX with the old xenon projection, which is more faded looking, more like a traditional projector, and IMAX with laser. Now, IMAX with laser is definitely closer to Dolby as far as brightness and colors go. One thing that the Dolby definitely had better was the seating arrangement. At my nearest AMC with IMAX and Dolby, the seating in IMAX was poorly designed, so that in many of the prime seating locations, your view of the bottom of the screen will be blocked by people's heads. And this must not just be from me, because I've heard this also on the 3D Blu-ray group online. Somebody else in another location was saying the same thing. Maybe it's just part of their standard design for IMAX at AMC, but they had the same problem, people's heads blocking the screen. But that was not a problem in Dolby at AMC. Also, the sound system used was Dolby Atmos, and I did notice on some occasions the upward speakers uh, making targeted sounds. But honestly, overall, it was just as atmospheric as most sound systems, and it wasn't a huge leap for me. It wasn't that different. Now, the big part, 4K HDR. That's huge. That is the future, especially when it comes to 3D. To have stereoscopic depth perception combined with this high amount of detail, especially on a larger screen, and this great lighting is essential, I believe, to making 3D have a chance at being mainstream. Anything less just takes something away, the key ingredient that you're getting in a lot of 2D content nowadays, and it makes the 3D all that much better. And at Dolby Cinema, they have their own brand of HDR, which they also have on some Blu-ray discs, Dolby Vision, and that, of course, has great capability for colors and blacks and brights. In fact, when they showed some previews at the beginning that were not uh, native 4K content, like for Ant-Man 3, which most of the Marvel movies aren't natively 4K, even if they're released that way. The difference was stark. And then, of course, there's the high frame rate, which is not something that many movies have been done in. You've got the Hobbit trilogy before this, a couple of other movies, but this is filmed in 48 frames per second. For the most part, it's variable frame rate. Sometimes it switches to 24, which is the standard way most movies are made. But of course, when it's in high frame rate, it's buttery smooth. And combined with 4K HDR 3D, forget about it. It's amazing. It's mesmerizing, as it should be, which is kind of the point of the whole thing, is to make it that much more realistic. Now, I had an interesting experience because this was the first time I ever seen Dolby 3D. Now, that's not to be confused with Dolby Cinema. Dolby 3D is their own brand of 3D filtering, 3D glasses that's used, in this case, at Dolby Cinema, but it's also used at some standard cinemas with standard digital projectors. It's a independent technology, and it's not as common. Most theaters use Real D, which are these gray tinted lenses, passive polarized. But Dolby 3D glasses are really a advanced form of anaglyph. Yes, anaglyph, where you have the red and blue lenses. Well, Dolby 3D glasses, when you look at some angles, you'll see it's a slight hue of red and green on the lenses. But uh, in practice, it doesn't really look that way. It's a very narrow spectrum that your eyes can't detect, And when you're wearing them, it looks like a full color 3D image, and it's actually brighter, so it looks amazing. There was just one unusual quirk that it may be a fault of Dolby 3D itself because of the different spectrums of colors, but in a handful of times, whenever things cut to complete black on the screen, my left eye would look darker than the right eye, and that was a little jarring. But for more subtle uses of darkness, that was not at all a problem. And no ghosting that I could tell at all either. The images looked perfectly blocked out for each eye and in sync. Started out with 2D trailers, and the 3D trailers were unannounced. They just started out of nowhere, no cue to put on the glasses. So it ended up being my first Dolby 3D experience was the Mario Brothers movie trailer, and that looked pretty good. Now, as for the 3D composition of the movie itself, of Avatar: The Way of Water, it was strong 3D as you would expect. Not painfully strong, like back in the old days when they were still figuring it out, but organically strong, well aligned. Um, are there window violations? Yes, but I've never been a real critic of window violations. I mean, that's more of relevant, I believe, with still photography because you're more likely to notice it. And then even then, there's instances where I believe window violations are um, necessary or even desired depending on the context. It's all based on context and intent. And there were some window violations, and I could only think of actually one. I forget the shot now, but there was one window violation that sort of a rivalry with something completely missing from one eye on the very far left of the screen, and that was a little attention grabbing. But otherwise, the 3D was extremely immersive. There was no exaggerated pop outs like 3D movies back in the day used to focus on, like that. I mean, stuff did come out of the screen at times, but it was all based on what had to happen, what was happening, and I couldn't really picture it being any different in a completely 2D movie. It was appropriate, and it didn't draw attention to itself. It was a very strong, organic 3D experience. And of course, no matter where you see it, the level of 3D is going to be the same. Many of you 3D aficionados already know that out there. I'm just saying that depending on who's watching. So I've heard some people say that different methods of 3D have more or less, or that a certain kind of 3D technology like shutter glasses will give you pop-outs. And of course that's absurd because it's just a left image and a right image. And the way they're originally made is not going to change. The 3D viewing technologies are just filters or ways to direct things to one eye or the other eye to separate them. That's the whole key of 3D display technology, to separate the pre-existing left and right images that already have the chosen depth baked in. So now to the actual movie. How was it? 3D or not? High tech or not? How was the story? Well, it was over 3 hours, and I can honestly say that not a second felt like fluff or filler. Not a second. I won't give any real spoilers here, but it goes up close and personal with many different characters, like Jake and Natiri's children, who are half-breeds, and also you probably saw the human boy in the trailer. He's a major character with an interesting arc, interesting things to deal with. If you've seen the trailers, you've also seen the Colonel, who's returned. So again, that running time of 3 hours plus, that was dictated first and foremost by the story that James Cameron needed to tell. Nothing more, nothing less. That's the way it needs to be done. That's the way it was done. And also a nice thing was that care was taken with every shot. And by that, I don't mean just throwing a lot of random detail and elements at the screen to give the illusion of artistic complexity. No, that would be lazy. Like that song, Give 'em the Old Razzle Dazzle. No, not like that.
Razzle dazzle 'em, and they'll never catch why.
What I mean is that care was taken with small nuances of expression and movement, which was there to help tell the story. And even exciting action scenes, which in some movies can just turn into a blur, a repetitive blur. Um, in this case, they use physics that were both grounding and exciting and innovative. The character development was masterful, and again, it's not a spoiler that the Colonel returns. He's in the trailer, and also that very cool shot in the trailer of him crushing his own skull. Well, from his past form, that is. And that was another cool part of his character. When they first introduced him, I was thinking, wait, if he's got these memories downloaded, then it's not really him. It's he just thinks he's him. And that did end up being talked about as a recurring theme. And this sense of self, and from a philosophical perspective, that's an interesting, intriguing topic. Also, Sigourney Weaver returns to play her daughter, per se, a very likable character with interesting story progress. And also Jake Sully's son. Um, if you saw the re-release this past summer of Avatar 1, there was a scene from Avatar 2, a bonus added at the end in some locations, of him and this whale-like creature. And now, having seen the whole movie, there's much more behind this plot-wise than just looking pretty. That's a huge part of the movie. So, the bottom line, as long as your local theater is doing everything right on the technical side, and mistakes do happen. Sometimes it can be too dark. They need to change the bulb. They have, I guess, maybe settings wrong, or maybe something out of alignment. Sometimes even forget to put the 3D filter in place, as has happened before. You got double image. Um, but if you have a competent enough theater, no matter where you go, this will probably look great. Standard theaters, it varies. Some will be showing it in open mat, which is basically roughly 16 by 9, a tall widescreen format. Some of them may need to show it cropped to a scope ratio, which seems wider, but it really has the top and bottom cut off. That can vary depending on theater, and there's no real way to know ahead of time, unfortunately. And interestingly, some standard theaters are also showing it in high frame rate. Some standard digital projectors can show it in 48 frames per second. Marcelo from the 3D Blu-ray group, he actually works at my local theater. I've talked before about how I'm more than satisfied with not only their seating layout, but also their consistency with brightness, clarity. They take their job seriously and do it well, unlike some theaters which always seem to mess something up. Uh, I've gone a number of times, they never have. With this one, I didn't actually go there. I went to Dolby, but he did tell me that they were originally going to show the 24 frames per second, but he fought for the high frame rate, and they agreed to do it, which is nice to hear. So I'm glad to hear that more people got exposed to that high frame rate version. If you want to hear about which IMAXs may or may not have had high frame rate, you can watch my other video about how to watch the original Avatar. This was back during its re-release, about how to watch that in high frame rate. The alternate title is In Defense of HFR. You can re-watch that one to also get a little bit more information about my thoughts on HFR. But for now, I will say I'm pretty confident to say Dolby is the best way to see this thing. Thankfully, there was no IMAX exclusivity for the aspect ratio, which I hate more and more. It's basically just a way to permanently hijack half the picture of a movie under this short-sighted marketing scheme. Not a fan. And some Blu-rays are now being released with that picture basically lost for now, except for 2D Disney Plus. So yeah, Dolby, you've got the high dynamic range, bright 3D, guaranteed HFR 4K. unlike IMAX, which is a branding disaster and a real toss-up, wide variations of technical capabilities. And in many locations, it seems bad seating. Maybe it just at the AMCs, I'm not sure. But regardless, I would go with Dolby if you can. And no matter where you see it, even if you saw it 2D, standard dynamic range, pan and scan, VHS, black and white, the story will still be the same. And if you enjoyed the original, I have no doubt you will enjoy this just as much, maybe even more in some ways. Whenever someone says or comments, Avatar, oh, that's Dances with Wolves, it's Fern Gully, I just can't help but roll my eyes. I mean, really? Out of all the dead horses, that's the one you're going to beat? Really showing off the old critical thinking skills there. I mean, it's basically a meme at this point just to say that. But the fact is that every film, piece of literature, music composition, you name it, borrows and more importantly builds on things that came before it. There's no way around that. So to blow out of proportion these small, relatively, elements in this otherwise hugely inventive world building is honestly a little disingenuous and at best inconsistent compared with criticism of other works. But one thing I think it might come down to the concept of it being kind of cool to hate on Avatar is that some viewers might be subconsciously annoyed by the straightforwardness with which Avatar tells its story. It's kind of a classical way of doing things. It wears its heart on its sleeve. It it shows every character for better or worse. Where appropriate, it uses dramatic speech, even emotional speech. Some may feel inclined to laugh when viewing this, but I'm convinced that's just a coping mechanism for the insecure viewer who doesn't want to look stupid or like they're getting played. Contrast this with movies that try really hard to be trendy, self referential, meta. There were many movies in different decades, you name it, 70s, 80s, 90s, that were so postmodern. I guess post, maybe postmodern. I don't know where we're at this point. But looking back, they aged like milk as tinges of naivety, arrogance, sort of like teenage angst. But like the first Avatar, this one I think has a better capability to age better. It picks up telling the same story from over a decade ago, and there's no need to build this sense of sentimentality or reverence for the movie that preceded it. And that's key because real world cultural relevance or the passing of real world time is irrelevant in this case. It's irrelevant to this fictional continuity. It exists outside of that. So an audience 100 years from now wouldn't need that camaraderie of or that generational perspective to appreciate the whole thing. They just see the straightforward story and be able to follow it. You can't say that for a lot of things. Star Wars: The Force Awakens, I'm looking at you. But speaking of Star Wars, James Cameron is kind of like George Lucas in that respect that he doesn't really care what people think. He's making what he wants to make, regardless of financial concerns or reviews. And I mean, he's actually kind of fortunate that Disney, which bought 20th Century Fox, now 20th Century Studios, he's actually kind of fortunate that Disney didn't hinder him. Because, I mean, they could have had him split the movie into two films to get more money from it. And in the end, it probably won't be very profitable once you consider all the expense to make and distribute it. But hopefully it will be just enough so that he can continue complete this vision he has, this story layout for future installments. So we have reached the end of the year 2022. It was a good year for 3D. More restorations from the 3D film archive of classic films from the 50s and other decades, natively shot 3D films that were almost lost. Um, I made a couple more movies. I started out the year January 1st with Real Bugs 3D. I also made a new installment in my New England series, Main Seasons, as well as the short documentary Why We Farm, also filmed in 3D on Blu-ray. And it was the 100th anniversary of 3D feature films. 1922, The Power of Love. Unfortunately, that movie is lost, but also that year, the second 3D movie, The Man from Mars, a science fiction comedy. I was able to release that on Blu-ray for the 100th anniversary as part of this program, 100 years of 3D movies featuring The Man from Mars. So it includes, as part of that program, a documentary and bonus features, lots of great bonus features in 3D. And what's up next? Um, well, let's hope 3D technology at home progresses. 3D Blu-ray has a great niche going, but let's hope it starts getting back a little bit more mainstream, because that means more content. Let's hope the standard Blu-ray 3D format we've been using for over a decade now finally gets a needed upgrade. We've been seeing it at the theaters recently, James Cameron pushing it, so let's hope this Blu-ray format, which maxes out at 1080p at 24 frames a second, finally gets into the 4K age with 4K HDR, high frame rate. Let's hope that comes to Blu-ray. There's really a lot of factors that go into play, from television manufacturers, projectors manufacturers, um, the Blu-ray Disc Association having to settle on a standard, and really the willingness of anyone else to do this. It really is all technically possible. It has been for years, but again, a lot of it just comes down to whether people who aren't enthusiastic about it, who are making their decisions maybe based on whatever a certain amount of profit that they feel is worth their time, whether they choose to do it or not. It's a real toss-up, but let's just hope 3D continues to progress. It already has a small but sizable fan base that are keeping it alive, and there's no reason that it can't continue to get even better and more mainstream next year. I'll see you then. Um, Obviously, that did not affect any other parts of the movie. That was just when it went complete. Ugh. That was, that was just when it went completely black.